So what Kant wants to do here in paragraph 9 on the logical function of the understanding in judgment is he wants to enumerate or put in a table all the functions, all the fundamental concepts or sort of acts of our thinking that are needed in order to form this unity of a judgment. And so what I want to do is I want to understand what is in this table. I don't really want to judge whether it's any good. That is something that we'll look at in the next video when we relate Kant's way of thinking about logic to contemporary ways of thinking about logic. But for now, what I want us is to get some understanding of what Kant means by this table of the logical functions of the understanding in judgment. Okay, so the first thing I would like to understand is why there are these 4 different headings. 1. Quantity of judgments. 2. Quality. 3. Relation. And 4. Modality. Under these, we will find sort of different options, but these are the general elements that for Kant have to be there in any judgment. Okay, how does that work? Well, let's take an example judgment. Something like all trees are plants, right? That is this unity, right? We think trees and plants together in a particular way. What is that way? Well, if Kant is right, we are going to be able to see 4 different parts, we could say, of that way. 4 different things, 4 different elements that have to be determined before the exact way in which we think tree and plant together has become clear. Now the first of these is the quantity of judgment, right? It is, when I think tree and plant together, one thing that I have to wonder about is, okay, when I'm gonna apply plant to tree, how far am I going to apply it? And one option, which is the option that is chosen in all plants or trees, is that I'm going to completely apply it. I'm going to apply it to all trees, right? All trees are plants. And of course there were other options there. I could have applied it merely to some trees, for instance, and say some trees are plants. That's a different way of linking plant and tree together in a unity. So that is quantity, right? Quantity is about how much of this first predicate, trees, I'm gonna apply my second predicate, plants. Okay. The second element that Kant is talking about is quality, right? And here Kant is thinking about in what sense I'm going to apply it, right? I could apply it, as I'm doing here, in a sort of positive way, like saying, yeah, plant does apply to tree. But of course I could also do something else. I could also say, no, plant does not apply to tree. That is also a way of forming a unity in judgment, right? If I say trees are not plants, no trees are plants, something like that, that is also a unity, a thought. I have brought plants and trees together, though in a qualitatively different way, right? Not in a positive way, but in a negative way. Okay, and again, we're going to look at the exact elements under these 4 headings in a moment. Third thing is what Kant calls relation. And this is maybe slightly more subtle, because in the kind of judgment that I'm using as an example here, all trees are plants, there's really only one relation that could play a role, and that is the relation that Kant is going to call categorical. It is the relation of predication, right? The are. All trees are plants, right? That's how I link plants and trees together. But Kant knows very well that not all judgments are going to be of this type, that I just have like a concept and another concept and I'm going to bring those together. In some judgments, I am going to bring judgments together. And we'll look at this in a moment, but the other elements here, the other elements of the relation, are ways of bringing judgments together rather than bringing concepts together. And so these two are mental acts of which we are to be capable if we are to, have the possibility of creating this unity of judgment in general. And then the fourth set in the table is called modality. And this is sort of the attitude that I take in judging. Right? So if 1, 2, and 3 are in a sense about the content of the judgment, about what's in there in the judgment, like how would you maybe like sort of write it down, or what's the proposition here. Now we can think of 4 as something that applies to the act of judgment itself. And one thing I can do is I can judge it, like sort of assert it, right? I can see all trees are plants and say, yeah, all trees are plants. But of course I could also be, well, it's possible that all trees are plants. Or if, I somehow have like I don't know, maybe I know that trees just have been defined as a specific kind of plant, in which case I know that necessarily trees are plants, that trees have to be plants, because if they weren't plants, they wouldn't be trees, right? And so these are different kinds of attitudes, or different kinds of strength, we could also say, of the judgment, and Kant calls this modality, right? And the term modality in philosophy is very often used to talk about the possible and the necessary, which is precisely what Kant is talking about here. Okay, so we can see those 3 different things happening in a judgment. I apply one thing to something else, and what is relevant is sort of the scope or quantity. What is relevant is the quality, whether I'm doing this positively or negatively, right? That's the quality. What is relevant is the exact relation between the 2 things that I'm bringing together. And what is relevant is the modality of my final assertion. So, Kant has, at least that's what he believes, and it's not crazy to think this, good reasons to believe that these are the 4 things that have to be determined for a judgment to be possible. If I lack any of these, there's no judgment, right? If I'm unable to, if I do not have sort of the basic concepts that make these elements of judgments possible, no judgment is going to happen, right? If I don't have the concept of all, or some, or anything else that could take its place, if I can't sort of determine the scope in the quantity in which one predicate applies to another, there's no way I can make this kind of judgment, right? It's impossible. And I can't maybe make any judgment at all. If I don't have the mental tools to make the distinction between a positive and a negative judgment, I can't make judgments at all. But if I don't have the mental tools to like really link, like bring into a relation these 2 concepts, if I don't have the is, one could say, the tool of predication, then I can't make any judgments. And finally, if I can't assert something, like either say it is so, or it might be so, or it has to be so, if I can't do that, I also can't make any judgments. So that's really what Kant is saying, right? I mean, I can lack a lot of concepts. I can lack the concept of plant and the concept of green, and still be able to make other judgments, right? Using other concepts. Who cares? But these, Kant is telling us, these 4 things that I've enumerated here, quantity, quality, relation, and modality, you need them. You can't do without them. You couldn't be somebody who is judging if you didn't have these in your repertoire. Okay, so then let us look in a little bit more detail at the 3 options that Kant finds in all these under all these headings. Why it's 3 in every case is something that a lot of people have thought about. A lot of people have actually been very critical about this. I'll say a little bit more about that in the next video. Kant himself has a footnote, I think it's in the Critique of Judgement, where he says something about this, where he explains that sort of the basic scheme here, which is very different from like a purely analytic logic, is that what he's doing here is he's thinking about conditions. And when you're thinking about conditions of possibility, you will always end up having a condition, something that is conditioned, and sort of the result of bringing them together. And that's a kind of 3-partite scheme. I don't want to delve into that, right? That's pretty advanced interpretation of this metaphysical deduction. I do want to point out here that Kant thinks that there is a reason and that you can say something about why it's 3 every time, why it has to be 3 every time. And as we are going to see, Kant is sort of suggesting that that the third item in any of these lists kind of, I mean, it is independent, but it also brings together something of the first 2 elements. Okay, let's look at these 3, let's look at the 4 groups of 3. 1. Quantity of judgments. Universal, particular, singular. The kind of judgments that Kant is thinking about are the following. All trees are plants is universal. Some trees are plants is particular. While this tree is a plant is singular. Right? So universal, particular, singular. It's all, it's some, or we might think of this in terms of existence. There exists a tree that is a plant. And finally, singular, which applies to, this object, this particular one. And Kant points out that, logicians generally don't talk about the singular very much, because you can see it as a kind of universal. How? Well, by sort of restrict, you can say all things that are this tree are plants, right? That's one way to think of that. All things that are this tree are plants. Okay, so that would be a sort of universal judgment. All Socrateses, maybe this is clearer if you use a name, right? If I want to say that Socrates is a philosopher, well, all Socrateses are philosophers. If I'm thinking about, if I use Socrates as the name of that particular individual, then this is a weird way of saying it, but it's kind of true, right? It kind of works. Okay. Anyway, what Kant thinks is that these are really 3 different acts of the understanding, right? To apply something to everything, to merely assert that there are some in a group that fit your predicate, or to think of one particular thing. Those are 3 different acts of the understanding, and so those are 3 different things that he wants to have in his table here. So that's quantity. Quality. Affirmative, negative, and infinite. Well, affirmative is saying something like all plants are trees. Negative is denying that, right? It's saying that not all plants are trees. Actually, I think the way that Kant thinks about it, if you have a negative universal judgment, it would be no plants are trees. No plants are trees. If it's a negative particular judgment, it might be some trees are not plants, so not all trees are plants. What about infinite? What is an infinite judgment supposed to be? Well, Kant isn't too clear about this, and in different circumstances he says different things about this, and there are different interpretations on the books. Here is an interpretation that I like, and that at least may be good enough to get us through the metaphysical deduction. I like to think of infinite judgments as, well, let's use the example, numbers are red. Numbers are red, like 2 and 3 and 4. I don't mean any written number, I mean like the numbers themselves, they are red. That's a weird claim, right? Is it false? Well, maybe it's false, but maybe it's just sort of too weird to be false, because numbers aren't colored at all, right? I mean, it's not just that they're not red, they're not even the right kind of thing to which to apply the predicate red. It's the kind of thing that in 20th or 21st century philosophy might be called a category mistake, right? You can't apply the predicate red to numbers, right? 2 is red, it just doesn't make any sense. Okay, so here is, I think that could help us think about the relation between, or the difference really, between a negative and an infinite statement. So a negative statement, on the way that I understand it, would be the claim, it's not the case that all numbers are red. Numbers are not red. They're not red. And that would be true. That would be unproblematically true. Numbers are not red, right? That concept doesn't apply to them. The infinite, as Kant introduces it, the infinite statement would be numbers are non-red, right? They're non-red. There's this predicate, this sort of negative predicate, non-red, and this predicate of the non-red applies to numbers. What does it mean to apply to something the predicate non-red? Well, it is to say that although the things that you apply it to do fall within the area of things that are, colored, and so this kind of predicate applies to them, nevertheless, the red predicate, the predicate red, does not apply to them. So to say that things are non-red, on this interpretation, to say that things are non-red, is to say that while they are colored, their color is not red. And so we can truly say that trees in summer are non-red. They're non-red because they are green, right? Trees in summer are non-red. But we can't say, it would be false or wrong to say, that numbers are non-red, because they don't fall within this area of the colored things. So here's another example that might... stones. Stones are mortal is certainly false, right? Stones can't die. Okay, what about stones are immortal, which would be the infinite judgment? Stones are immortal. That doesn't seem quite right. Stones aren't immortal. They're not mortal, but they're also not immortal. Like, the concept of dying, of mortality, just doesn't apply to them, right? Only living things can be mortal or immortal. And so while it makes perfect sense to say that God is immortal, or to say that, I don't know, Highlander is immortal, it doesn't make any sense to say that stones are immortal. But it does make sense to use the negative judgment and say that stones are not mortal, right? That the concept of mortality doesn't apply to them. Okay, so this, I think, is the difference between the negative and the infinite. It's like affirmative is stones are mortal, the negative is stones are not mortal, and the infinite is stones are immortal. And those are three different kinds of statements. And it's three different acts of the understanding, right? To say that something is the case, to say that something is not the case, and to put something in a determinate, but not like a determinate space, but only in a negative sense, only by pointing out where in that space they are not. That seems to be a third act of the understanding, the infinite judgment. Okay, relation, categorical, hypothetical, disjunctive. A categorical relation is a relation between, it's what happens in a predicative claim of the form, all trees are plants, right? Or stones are immortal. It's the are or is there. It brings those two concepts together. The hypothetical and the disjunctive relation are relations between whole judgments, right? A hypothetical relation between judgment A and judgment B, something like, because you didn't read the Critique of Pure Reason, you don't understand this video. Or rather, maybe I should say, because you didn't listen to these videos, you don't understand the Critique of Pure Reason. That's what I want to say. That's a hypothetical judgment. Well, actually, a hypothetical judgment is the if-then form of that, right? If you don't listen to these videos, then you won't understand the Critique of Pure Reason. That's a true hypothetical judgment. If then. If this, then that. I'll say more about the exact nature of the hypothetical in the next video. Because it is, spoiler alert, not the same as the if-then of contemporary logic, of our logic. Finally, the disjunctive relation is also a relation between two or more, Kant says, two or more judgments, which basically tells us that they exhaust the possibilities. That these things are mutually exclusive and jointly exhaustive. So something like anything is either mortal or immortal or not mortal. Like stones are either mortal or immortal or not mortal. That would be a disjunctive judgment, right? It gives me a bunch of options, and one of them has to be true, but not more than one of them can be true. This is sort of the way, all the ways that reality can be. These are the options. That's the kind of thing that Kant is thinking of here. And so it's very different from an if-then construction. It is sort of trying to map the space of possibilities, not by linking things together and saying if this is the case, that is the case, like these go together, but by saying, well, here are all the options, and I can map it out into these different areas. One of these has to be true. Okay, and so finally, modality, right? And basically, I already told you this. If we have any kind of claim, we can either assert it, right, and say, well, if I judge it, I can judge it like it's true. I can judge it like it might be true. It's possible. That's weaker, right? If something is true, it must be possible. But if it's possible, it doesn't have to be true. And I can make it stronger and say it has to be true, right? Given the other things that I know, this has to be the case. Or maybe even purely a priori, this has to be the case, right? That's a different kind of judgment yet. 3 different strengths, really, of affirming something. So that is what the elements in Kant's table of the logical functions of the understanding in judgments are, what they mean. Is this any good? Can Kant's table be defended? Well, it has been attacked a lot, and I want to say more about that in our next video.